Good morning and welcome to Peace Out, where we're all learning together that we have God's peace. We just need to let it rain, right? And we're working through the process of letting it rain, right? And so we know we got his peace. We also know we can just ask for wisdom. We also know we have things like forgiveness and his love. But it's the process of learning to trust those things, learning to count on those things, right? Those attributes of God, that just his ever abiding presence. I mean, he doesn't leave you, right? Where would he go? He can't go anywhere because he's everywhere. We've talked about that a lot early on, haven't said it in a while, but he doesn't have the capacity to leave us. He is always with us, and that's really what I'm going to be talking about a little bit today. I was reading in Daniel. I'm in Daniel 3, reading about the three Hebrew children, and the three men. They really weren't children. I don't think we called them the three Hebrew children, right? But they were the three Hebrew children when were taken captive, and we have to add that element to the story too, right? They were not in the best of situations. They didn't have their own houses necessarily. They had been taken captives. They had been taken captive at the same time Daniel was. That's kind of why they're in the book of Daniel. That would make sense, right? And so, but they were taken captive as young men, or maybe late teens or something, and mutilated and made slaves early in their lives, and yet they held on to the promises of God, right? And they didn't just presume that God was going to save them from the fire. We know King Nebuchadnezzar, that's hard to say, isn't it? He built a big idol and said everybody has to bow to it. And when the music plays, which is interesting because we use music to express worship to God, and so he wanted to distort that. He wanted to stain that. He wanted the people of the land to worship something other than God, right? And so he said, when the music plays, you're all supposed to bow. And they went, and if you don't, we're going to throw you in the fire. We're going to throw you in the furnace. And I can't picture that in my mind. I need to go to look at some pictures and see what it might have looked like, right? But it was a furnace, and they could turn it up. So I don't know if it was gas, wood, coal, but they turned it up for them because they said, you know what? God is able to deliver us, but if he doesn't, we're still not going to bow. And I'm like, man, I love that tenacity. I love that dedication to keeping your worship pure. I love that determination to just not let anything take that place of God. We're not bowing to your idol. They, I mean, they knew they were risking their lives to do that, right? They knew they were probably going to die for not bowing to the idol, and yet they still said, God's able to deliver us, but if he doesn't. And see, we don't necessarily have a king setting up a physical idol that is asking us to bow to, right? When their music plays. But our culture sometimes wants to distract us from God, wants us to listen to any music but godly music, right? Wants to drag us away from all things that are true and pure and holy. So we have a culture that's trying to distract us and drag us into a fiery furnace, so to speak, right? But even though it's not physical, and yet we have to become just as tenacious as these guys and go, you know what? I'm not going to be distracted from my God. He is able to deliver me from anything I find myself in. But if he doesn't, I'm still going to worship only God. Our culture wants us to not pray in public. Don't pray in school. They remove the Bible. Don't take your Bible to school. Don't pray in school. Don't pray at a football game. That's one reason I've actually started kind of watching NASCAR with Chris. It was early for him, but every race starts with the national anthem and a prayer. Every single race. That's one reason I'm like, okay, I'm a NASCAR fan now. I'm not really, but I can be, right? Because they keep that element there, because our nation as a whole has turned its back on God. But this is not a reason to fear. This is just a reason to be more tenacious like these guys, and to continue to pray and be a witness for the light that lives in us, right? And the life that lives in us. So we're not lost yet. We're not in a heathen nation yet, but our culture wants to try to distract us from all things holy, right? It wants to distract us from all things pure. It wants us to distract us from the one true God. And we've got to be like these guys and go, no. So the first miracle was that they tied them and to throw them in there. Okay? And the first miracle was the men who threw them in there were destroyed by the fire. Now that's a whole sermon in itself, but we won't go there. But the men who were going to throw them in, as they were throwing them in, the fire killed them. That's how hot the fire was. That was the first miracle, because it did not touch the three Hebrew children. It did not touch them. It did not harm them. It did not burn them. It didn't even singe the hair on their head. And if you're sitting by a campfire, you can singe your eyebrows and your hair real easy, right? And this fire was much bigger than that, and it didn't even singe them. That's one miracle. Here's another miracle. I think I mistitled this, because I started to title it Missed Miracles, and then I decided to go with the pressure, because when the pressure's on, it's easy to miss the miracles, because we're so busy trying to avoid the pressure that we miss what God's doing in our midst sometimes, right? And so the first thing was that the other people were killed as they were being thrown in. So they were spared from being killed from the intense heat in that fiery furnace, right? Secondly, and this is something that stood out to me today, they were bound with ropes. They tied them up tight. And when they threw them in, they didn't get injured. I because Chris has a head injury, and I've been thrown out of a couple of vehicles and had severe concussions and stuff because of that. I always think head injury. Somebody falls. Somebody UFC. I'm always like, don't fall like that. You're gonna, or whatever. Or football. I'm like, oh, no, 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 not a head injury. Anything but a head injury, right? And so then there's other things that are even worse. But for me, that's the big thing. And I thought they didn't even hit their head. Their hands were tied. They couldn't even put their hands out to protect themselves as they were being thrown in, right? Because they didn't just walk in, they were thrown in, and it says the men throwing them in were wiped out, and then they fall in. But they couldn't protect themselves. They couldn't put their hands out. That's a natural response. And sometimes aren't we in circumstances and situations where we feel very unprotected? We feel like we can't put our hands out. But you know what? When we're in a spot where we feel like we can't protect ourselves, it's the perfect spot to trust God to do it for us, because they did not get injured when they fell in. They couldn't put their hands out. They couldn't soften the blow. They couldn't do anything with their hands because they were tied. Their hands were tied. I assume tied behind their back, so I assume it was tied behind their backs, right? But they couldn't put their hands out to protect their face from hitting the concrete. It had to be something of concrete or stone to be a fiery furnace, right, to hold the fire. And so I thought, man, that's a miracle that I've read this story 100 times and never thought about that. And sometimes when we're going through our day-to-day life, there are those little instances where we can't get our hands up fast enough to protect ourselves. But you know what? We don't have to, because if you remember, God is our shield. God is our protector, and He's got us. Even though He did not keep them from going through the fire, He protected them in the fire. And we can trust Him to do the same thing in the circumstances of life, because life can heat it up sometimes, baby, right? It can get hot. It can get difficult. It can get, we can have pressure on every side. We can be pressured in our jobs, in our relationships, in our finances. You've got a list. I got a list. There can be pressure coming from everywhere. But in the middle of that, God can be the pressure release, right? And He protects us from being harmed, from even going into the fire, right? And then, of course, we know that the king was like, whoa, didn't we throw 3 people in there? And I'm looking there and I'm seeing 4 men in the fire. Who is that 4th man? So he said, get them out. So they got the 3 men out. And that, to me, that is just a manifestation, if that's the right word, of Isaiah 43, where God said, when you go through the fire, I'll be with you. It won't destroy you. And so the things that come in our lives that can be hot are not, you know what burned in the fire? What burned in this fire wasn't the men that was thrown in. The men that was throwing the men burned, right? But the three Hebrew children, what held them bound is the only thing destroyed in the fire. Those ropes melted in that heat, but the men did not. That's our miracle working God. And when the pressure is on and the fire gets hotter, He can release those things that have us bound. He'll protect us from the fall, right? The launch into the fire. He can protect us in the fire. He's in the fire with us. And the only thing that we're going to lose is what's holding our souls bound. Aren't those really cool things right there? So I'm going to be thinking about that today. I hope I gave you something to think about. So because we know that God was with them, He protected them, and He let the fire burn off what was holding them bound, we can expect the same miracle working God to do that in our souls today as we face the fires of life, right? That's why we can peace out. So peace out. Have a great day, and I'll see you tomorrow.